Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Calling this meeting of the Tax Committee to order. Vice Chair Norris, do we have a motion to approve the minutes?
We do, Madam Chair. I move to approve the minutes from our January 4th meeting.
Thank you very much. Is there any discussion on the motion? Not seeing any. All those in favor of approving the minutes for January 4th, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you so much. Welcome back. I just want to take this chance to just say thank you again to Lee Davids and to the members of the Tax Committee. On the GOP side, we know that that having our conformity bill passed like that could only have happened if you went and did some work with your caucus, and so I'm really grateful for that. Thank you. I think it was a good thing that we did for our taxpayers yesterday, and I'm really proud to partner with you all on that. So thank you. So we're kind of getting back to the normal order of business because, as we mentioned last week when we met, we were kind of rushing ahead, and so. So yeah, this is really our chance to get to know our incredible nonpartisan staff and to get some grounding in this material, which is somewhat complicated, but if Representative Davidson and I can figure it out, probably anybody can. It just takes a little bit of time, but and it's not as I think our staff are really able to make it so that this subject matter isn't as intimidating as it might appear on the surface or some of the ways that we think about tax policy. So, they're really open to questions, to inquiries. I know that we both have really amazing partisan staff. Also, kind of they should be your first stop if you have kind of areas that you want to kind of learn more about. We did do a round of intros, but we're going to do another one. I'm sorry. I would love if you're willing to share, just because we're kind of learning about each other on the team. I mean, if there's anything about your community that you'd like us to know, I would love it if we just went around and said, our names and our districts, and again the communities that we represent, because I'm trying to get my head around it. And also, if there is a particular kind of interest or an experience that you have in your life that draws you to have requested the tax committee, because we know you all requested the tax committee if you got on it. So so just sort of what are some of your interests in this area, or what brings you to the work? That would be great. And maybe we'll just start to my left with Mr. McQuillan.
Sure. So my name is Patrick McQuillan, and I'm the committee administrator for taxes, and I've previously been the committee administrator for the last 4 years for Chair Liebling in HHS.
Thank you, Greg Davids. I represent southeastern Minnesota. I border Iowa and Wisconsin. So tax policy really does affect my area. We're kind of, it's basically an agricultural district, small towns. We have one stoplight. We tried to get rid of that, but the DOT wouldn't let us. So that's in Chatfield. So it's all of Fillmore, all of Houston, and 4 townships in Mauer. Great district.
Bjorn Olson, 22A, that's southern Minnesota. I border along Iowa. Very similar conversation of what Lee Davids has for a situation with constituents that he represents. My big reason for wanting to be on the tax committee is because I, in fact, pay taxes, as do most of my constituents.
Thank you.
Hi, Patty Anderson, 33A. It's Forest Lake down to Matamidi. So Forest Lake, Hugo, Grant, Delwood, Matamidi, Willity is the southern end of the district, so in Washington County. I live in Delwood. My main reason for wanting to be on a tax committee is just I have a lot of knowledge about taxes. I'm a business owner. Throughout most of my career, I've owned multiple different companies. Most of my neighbors are business owners, and so what happens in Minnesota greatly, reflect, my employees and myself. So, yeah.
Madam Chair, Chris Wazensky, House District 15A. I appreciate being on a tax committee. Just from the foundation of, I represent a district that's a border community to South Dakota. And, oftentimes those are the conversations that we have when we're trying to recruit business or recruit expansion in our neck of the woods from a manufacturing base. So, we're dealing with a lot of issues with the commonality of regulatory issues, whether it's DNR, MPCA, but also from a tax structure standpoint. We have an aging population, and so, oftentimes when you have a $50 flight to Arizona with a lot of folks, people are making decisions that remove them from the state when they retire, whether that's Social Security taxes or business taxes, keeping and maintaining a vibrant workforce, but also a business atmosphere is important. And that's why I choose to be on tax committee to represent those issues. I'm a farmer by background, and so I don't serve on ag committee, but I want to make sure that ag interests and rural manufacturing are representative in a tax area, but not being on particular committees that are named that. So,
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jim Joy, I represent 4B. North Moorhead is in my district. Moorhead, the center Moorhead is not, but we do border North Dakota, and we're constantly hearing a lot of conversation about them. So tax is very important to me and my district. I'm a small business owner, so very familiar with taxes. Been in small business since I was 16, and I've worked down here, so I've actually worked across to Wisconsin side. So I just am excited to be on this committee, and I feel that we can do some good for the taxes in Minnesota. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jeff Whitty, 57B, Lakeville. One of the reasons in Lakeville we have industrial, we got small businesses, and obviously our housing. And during the campaign, I heard a lot from the people who represent throughout the community. The Social Security tax being one of 13 states is an area that they would like us to look at, but also for business. And with our businesses leaving the state, and you got some decline in people leaving, we have opportunities to continue to help the families and keep them in Minnesota and make it a solid partnership. Thank you.
Madam Chair, Mike Weiner, 5B, small business owner myself, along with a lot of these gentlemen, and also a part-time farmer. We have a few beef cows. A numbers guy. Numbers works for me. And when I looked at taxes, this seemed to be a good fit. It also has a big effect on our state. It was mentioned aging population, but also people leaving our state because of the tax issues. When they're moving to tax-friendly environments versus doing business here, that's something that really affects me because we see this rural environment leaving the state when I'd like to have the opportunities for people to maintain a life and a living in greater Minnesota. And that's why I wanted to be on the taxes. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My apologies for being late. My last meeting went long. I'm Kristen Robbins. I represent 37A, which is Western Maple Grove and Corcoran, Greenfield, Independence, Loretto, and Maple Plain and Medina. And this will be my second term on taxes, and my interest is I'm an economist, and before I was in the legislature, I worked really hard on issues related to Minnesota's ability to compete globally and with other states. And so to me, tax policy is one of the areas where we can really shine as a state and really bring life to long-term economic growth by the types of policies we put in place and really help families and businesses. So to me, this is my preferred area of work. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I'm Kelly Kanabati, and I am the GOP researcher.
Great.
Hi, I'm Sean Haydorn. I'm the DFL researcher.
Greg.
I'm Representative Steve Elkins from Bloomington, and I'm like Representative Robbins. I'm an economist by education. I served 20 years in local government on the Bloomington City Council, Metropolitan Council, and so I've long had kind of a wonky interest in studying how tax structures influence the behaviors of organizations, including governments, and in finding tax structures that make the economy more efficient.
Great. So we both have our economists. That's good. We got to check the box off. Representative Howard.
Thanks, Chair. Michael Howard, representing District 51A, which is Richfield, a little bit of South Minneapolis, and also the airport. So if your flight's ever delayed, just shoot me a quick text. I'm sure I can, excited to be on the tax committee, not just because I've heard Representative Davids and others say it's the best committee, but it really is a committee that sort of touches everything we're trying to do here. Our tax system is a reflection of our values. And so whether we're talking about educational attainment, healthcare, there's so many areas where our tax code is a reflection of how and who we are as a state government and how we respond to the needs of our constituents. In particular, I'm very interested in the intersection of taxes and housing, an area that challenges us all across the state, and excited that we can do a lot of good intersectional work here in the tax committee related to housing as well.
Madam Chair, members, Dave Pinto, representing the southwest part of St. Paul, Highland Park, Groveland area. I was going to say we're a border community to Minneapolis and Mendota Heights. I had wanted to be on taxes kind of all the way through. I was on property taxes my first term and then just had conflicts, not able to. But for similar reasons that others have referenced, this is really such foundational work in this committee. The work touches everything else that we do. I've had the opportunity to work in the HHS and education areas because of my committee chair work, and this is the place that funds that important work. And so I'm really glad to be here. And I should note too, I have a business degree in addition to my law degree, and so the chance to apply some of that and that economic thinking is appealing to me as well. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Cheryl Joachim, represent Hopkins, St. Louis Park, and Edina. Live in Hopkins, and one thing I'd like folks to know about Hopkins is we used to be West Minneapolis. We're 2 by 2 miles, have an amazing main street still that you should check out. But I like Representative Pinto, we came in together and got on property taxes right away. And I was interested in the area because I spent 9 years on the city council and saw it right firsthand working with constituents. But mostly, as folks have been saying, it's really foundational to how we fund our state. And as the Education Finance Chair, it's particularly of interest to me this year too as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm Dave Listlegard, 7B, the Iron Range. As a former mayor and city councilor, taxes are extremely important. And for property taxes, we're seeing the rise in property taxes. And what we're going to do this year in the committee that I'm going to be a part of, and this one, is we're going to peel back that onion and find out why property taxes are rising. I think that there's multiple reasons for that, and I think it's important that the state of Minnesota and our colleagues see what that is. And so that'll be the focus that I'm going to do. And the other reason I'm on here is that Tommy Rukavina said I had to.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Andy Smith from Rochester. A couple people have talked about their degrees. I have 2 degrees in theology, so I think that's really going to help out in this committee. I am very excited to be on taxes. I believe that government is a force for good in the world, and one of the primary tools that government needs to be able to be that force of good is taxes. So very excited to be a part of this. 25B, my district, is right downtown Rochester. It's a really unique district because some of the lowest income areas in our city, as well as the highest earning areas in our city, are in my district. So, and the in-between as well. So a lot of different constituent voices talking from a lot of different places in the tax code. I'm also a small business owner, own 2 businesses myself, so very excited to be on this committee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Liz Olson, and I represent the central and west parts of Duluth. And there are 2 economists. There are 2 people with theology degrees also on the tax committee. So watch out, world. But I wanted to serve on the tax committee as the chair of Ways and Means. I feel like it's the B side to the record. The A side being we appropriate things, we spend on the things we believe Minnesotans need, but we need to fund that. And so a lot of that discussion happens in this committee. And so those 2 pieces really come together to give the full perspective. And having Chair Gomez at the helm was also a good reason to sign up for this committee. But I'm excited about thinking about this through a values lens and thinking about this through an equity lens and thinking about what it then does for the rest of the things we want to fund for our state.
I'm Jeff Brand from the St. Peter area, represent District 18A, St. Peter, the northern part of Mankato and the surrounding area there. A former city council member in St. Peter, so for me, taxes is all about how we make sure that we get our streets, our services, everything's taken care of. It's heavily dependent upon taxes, obviously. Local government aid is a good intersection with this committee. And so this is my second time being on the committee. I was excited to be on it last time. I thought we did some great things. Really looking forward to doing more. One thing that you should know about St. Peter, it was supposed to be the capital of Minnesota.
Still sore about that.
They won't let us forget it either, will they? I'm sorry, just a moment. Representative Swedzinski.
Wasn't it stolen from you?
Representative Brandt.
Well, not me, but from the fine people of St. Peter, yes.
Thank you. Apologies, Representative Agbaje.
Oh, no problem, Madam Chair. I just liked Representative Brand's mic drop. I mean, what are you going to say? My name is Esther Agbaje. I represent House District 59B, which covers parts of downtown Minneapolis and parts of North Minneapolis. So similar to other representatives here, I have some of the high net worth earners and some of the most low-income people across our state. For me, taxes was one of my first choices. I'm glad to be on the committee again a second time around. And it is really just goes back to how we take care of each other, how we fund our state, how we make sure that people have the resources that they need to succeed. And so I'm looking forward to all the good work that we're going to do together on this committee and a lot of really great ideas that I'm looking forward to hearing. So thank you, Madam Chair.
All right. Thank you, Madam Chair. I wasn't sure if I should wait to be recognized, but
Yeah.
there we go.
Norris was in between us. He was blocking us.
Fair enough. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Liz Lee. I represent the northeastern corner of St. Paul in District 67A. I'm also very excited to be in this committee led by Chair Gomez. I think we share similar values on our vision of the tax code. I've said, I think our tax code is objectively regressive, and so, my goal is also to look at, how we can make it more equitable, because this is really a statement of values, right? I help run a small business. My mom ran a small business, so I understand that aspect. And the vision and the lens that I bring to the work is that there are a lot of people out there, small businesses, working class people who don't have lobbyists and advocates that come to the Capitol. And so also very interested in how we can use the tax code to make people's lives better, especially with our trifecta. So thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, sir.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Matt Norris. I represent District 32B, which is the communities of Blaine and Lexington. We're home to the National Sports Center, which is the second largest tourist attraction in the state of Minnesota. Also home to the Anoka County Airport and all kinds of other good stuff in my district. I've got experience with our tax system from a professional perspective. For almost 5 years, I led a program that helped low-income families utilize the K-12 education tax credit. It's a tax credit I know is close to the heart of Representative Robbins as well. But that really gave me firsthand experience of seeing how lower income folks interact with our tax system. Also an appreciation for how our tax system can be used as a lever to influence other areas of policy. For instance, increasing access to after-school programs, computers, school supplies. But then I also, on the campaign trail, heard a lot about taxes from my constituents constituents, property taxes, other taxes. So I think this is an assignment that I'm really excited about, excited to work with all the members of the committee, and of course, you as well, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody, for doing that. I really appreciated it, and it's great to just learn a little bit more about others. We've been joined by Representative Koznick. So, speech. So yeah, just we're learning a little bit about each other's districts and kind of like.
I was watching.
Okay, you got the idea.
I did, Madam Chair, I did have the honor of being trapped in the hallway by former representative and tax chair, arguably one of the finest ones of two, in Cheryl Chetsky. So we were reminiscing a little bit about tax committee. I'd been on for 2 terms, 4 years, and so I'm excited to be back on it. I live in Lakeville and represent the Northwest and Southern Lakeville. Representative Whitty across the table here from me is taking over some of my other area. He's going to do a great job. So Lakeville's well represented here on the tax committee, but I also represent the communities of Credit River, Elko, Newmarket, and a couple townships. And so I'm looking forward to being back on the committee, and sorry I was late. I thought I could sneak in.
Representative Robbins didn't let you get away with that. So thank you so much, everybody, for that. I did promise Rep. Davids that I would skip my dissertation on why taxes are about love and care, so I'm going to hold to my word. But, I think that I just think that, some of the things that my committee members said really reflect the lenses that I bring to this work, which are that I do believe that taxes are how we care for each other in a society. They're the reasons that we have schools that everybody can go to, the reason that we have infrastructure, the reason that when you call 911, somebody's there, that all gets paid for by taxes. So this is how we sort of are in charge of, defining the outlines of what the public good is in our state. And, and I do believe in investment in the public good. And I believe that we have an obligation to take care of each other, and especially that we have an obligation to care for those who are vulnerable, for little ones, for elders, for people who are struggling. And so, and I think a progressive tax code that recognizes, right, that if we don't, at the state level, if we don't use our tax tools and make the investments that our communities need, that we pass those decisions along to our local partners, along to our counties and our cities, and they then are in the position of having to rely on their property tax levies in order to fund basic services. And property taxes are a more regressive form of tax than a lot of the ones that we're able to use at the state level. And we have an obligation, we have a constitutional obligation to provide for the education of the children of this state. We have an obligation just sort of morally, I think, when we're in these positions to ensure that even if it's a hard thing, that we're doing our work properly to fund that public good. So with that, it took up a little more time than I thought to our nonpartisan staff, but appreciate your patience. So for the rest of the time, we are going to get our overview from House Fiscal and our nonpartisan researchers. If you guys don't mind, I just remember when the first time that I saw these presentations, and so much of it was kind of new to me, and I had a lot of questions as we went along and was allowed to ask those. So if you have a question, I think we shouldn't save them to the end. We should all sort of, I'll kind of interrupt you guys gently if I see that a member wants to ask a question, just so that we can kind of respond to those as we go. So with that, I will turn it over. I think we're starting with Kathy Schill. If everybody, you guys kind of know the drill, introduce yourselves for the record, maybe tell us a little bit about, sort of the areas that you cover, if there's a division, and please proceed. Thank you.
Great. We'll try this again. Is the microphone working? It doesn't appear. Okay. Good afternoon, Chair Gomez and members of the Tax Committee. My name is Kathy Schill, and I'm a fiscal analyst with the House Fiscal Analysis Department. Before we get started, I'd like you to turn to your packet and make sure you have 3 documents that we'll be using today. The first looks like this. This is a slide deck of the background briefing on Minnesota taxes. The second document is something a bit thicker. It's information on income, corporate, franchise tax and sales taxes and other state taxes. This is the lengthy document that you would turn to for additional information. And the third item is the tax staff list of responsibilities. It's a single-page document, 2-sided. So we'll begin with the background briefing here. Today's presentation on Minnesota state taxes will provide background information that includes 4 areas. Introduction of the 7 nonpartisan staff assigned to the Taxes Committee. Important resources used in committee that provide more in-depth information on bills and tax-related issues. A general review of state tax policy, and some preliminary tax basics important for committee work and the deliberations done here. From our previous introductions, or those that will occur as we go on, the House nonpartisan tax team consists of 7 members, 5 of which are from House Research. This slide shows House Research analysts with their respective preliminary or primary areas of responsibility. For a more complete list, you can turn to that single page, which will give you a greater expansive list of responsibilities. But first off, I'm just going to name them really quickly, and they'll introduce further when they come up. We have Sean Williams, Chris Clayman, Alex Hagler, Jared Swanson, and Justin Cope. And your House fiscal staff include Ms. Tumplin and I, both fiscal analysts with House Fiscal Analysis Department. My general responsibility in the tax committee is the state general levy, and then I do anything having to do with appropriations. The spending side of the spreadsheet is what we call it, so that would be tax refunds, aids, credits, and other items. Nonpartisan staff serve the committee in a variety of roles. First, House research staff draft bills and amendments, summarize bill content, provide overviews and background research, answer drafting and legal questions, and then, when applicable, conduct modeling of proposed changes in the tax law. House fiscal staff track revenue and budget impacts of current law and proposed law changes offered both by the executive and the legislature. We also interpret and analyze revenue estimates and fiscal notes, and offer analysis of spending and revenue proposals. Now, all nonpartisan staff also provide confidential services to each legislator when requested, usually with bill development, budget, or revenue information, or other policy proposals. For each hearing of the Taxes Committee, tax staff provide a number of documents important to its deliberations. First, we have bill summaries, which is a brief on the content of each bill. Second is a revenue estimate. A revenue estimate is created by the Minnesota Department of Revenue, or for short, DOR, that provides an analysis of how proposed bill language would change with tax collections or state budget expenditures for property tax relief programs. We also have fiscal notes. Fiscal notes provide an estimate of administrative costs to relevant state agencies, prepared under the direction of the Legislative Budget Office, with the assistance of all relevant state agencies. We also use legislative tracking sheets, spreadsheets, and that's prepared by your House fiscal staff. The taxes spreadsheet is a summary of cost information compiled from revenue estimates, fiscal notes, and other sources for a single bill or for an omnibus bill. And we'll go into more detail at a later time on those tools. Also used in committee are other documents, which include partisan briefs, written testimony, and other information, including some studies that are sometimes electronic in nature. And this is for help with your discussion. Now we have this slide for frequently used terms. Like other committees, the Taxes Committee has a lexicon of terms related to its jurisdiction, including budget terms, tax incident terms, and other terms. Budget terms include FY, which is fiscal year. That's from July 1 to June 30 of each year. We have a tax year and a pay year. Now, those both follow the calendar year scenario, January 1 to December 31st. Now, for tax incidence terms, we have tax incidents. That's the final burden of a tax or taxes. Incidence refers to the individual, company, demographic unit or group, economic sector, or income stratum that ultimately bears the burden of a tax or total taxes. Tax burden is the immediate impact of the tax on a taxpayer. For an individual, tax burden is usually expressed as a proportion to income. Now, we also use the terms progressive tax and regressive tax. A progressive tax is the type of tax that takes a larger percentage of income from taxpayers as their income rises. An example is Minnesota's income tax. A regressive tax is a tax that is exactly the opposite. It's when the higher income taxpayers pay a smaller percentage of their income than lower income taxpayers because the tax is not based on ability to pay. And an example of that is the sales tax. And we'll get into more detail on this as each tax type is presented. Moving to the other category, other terms, a tax expenditure refers to a revenue loss attributable to a tax preference, such as an exemption, a deduction, a reduced rate, a credit, or a deferral of tax liability. And then you'll also hear whether a tax is a refundable credit or a non-refundable credit. Now remember, a tax credit is the amount of money that can offset a tax liability. Now, a refundable credit can reduce that net tax below zero. A filer whose credit exceeds a tax liability can receive the balance as a refund. In contrast, a non-refundable credit can only reduce the net tax to zero. And now I'll turn to my colleague, Ms. Templin.
Hello, I'm Cynthia Templin, House Fiscal Staff. I will be going over the next 4 slides on resources available, and here we're going to take a dive into looking at state tax revenues or all revenues received by the state. I will be covering, in this slide, shows the highest revenues received by the state at the highest level for public services. In the most recently closed fiscal year 22, as you can see on this slide, it shows that a total of $98.6 billion was received from the state from all revenue sources. And in the next 4 slides, the slides will drill down to look at state tax revenues only. But on this slide in particular, the slide shows, again, all revenue received by the state for public services in fiscal 22. And you can see that the largest share of the total comes from state and local tax revenue, or over 45% of the total. The second largest source of revenue or funding comes from the federal government, and that's about 25% of the total of $98.6 billion.
Ms. Templin, I wonder, so just since this is for fiscal year 2022, and I assume that some of the federal COVID relief programs are still kind of, there's money still flowing to the state. Do you know off the top of your head if this, like what the kind of typical number is for the federal resources? Or if not, if you could get it to me later, that's good too.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, that is something I would like to get to you later.
Okay.
As a fiscal analyst, I like precision too.
Yes.
So I don't want to give a number that I will get back to you on that.
Thank you very much.
And then, thank you for the question, Madam Chair. And then moving on, the third and fourth largest sources to the state come from intergovernmental and state and local non-tax revenue. Each of these sources are under 15% of the total. Drilling down to the next slide and moving on. This slide shows looks at own source revenue. And in this slide, own source revenue is state and local taxes only. In fiscal year 22, $45.4 billion was collected from state and local governments in taxes. And of that total, the largest share came from the state government, or over 70% of the total. The second largest share of the total was from property taxes collected from local governments. The smallest share of the total was collected from local sales taxes and other taxes. And then
I am so sorry. I lost my cell phone.
Oh, I see. I'm like, okay. That's like the fun. We were all looking at Joanna like, is this your first tax committee or no?
Apartments here.
Thank you. So before we go on, Ms. Templin, I think Representative Anderson, did you have a question you wanted to ask?
I did. Thank you, Chair Gomez. Oh, thank you, Chair Gomez. Local property tax and local school district. So is the local property, is that city and county combined? And the other is schools?
Ms. Templin.
Is that correct? Okay. And then the other.
Anderson.
Yeah. Is that good? Mr. Chair, and then other taxes, generally your watersheds and those other things, Met Council.
Ms. Templin. Great. Representative Anderson, did you have any other questions? Okay, thank you.
moving on to the third slide out of the total of 4 slides that we are going to be presenting on resources available. This slide shows taxes collected by the state government only. It excludes local taxes. The total collected by state government in fiscal 22 is $33.8 billion. The $33.8 billion was deposited into both dedicated and non-dedicated funds in state government. The top 3 tax types in terms of revenue raised are individual income, state sales tax, and corporate franchise tax. These taxes, or these tax types, constituted 80% of the total state tax revenue, with income taxes having the largest share of the total at 49%. All other tax types comprise a smaller share of the total. And the final slide that we are presenting to you in the presentation on resources available, the presentation of the slide is slightly different because it shows the biennial total, or a total for 2 fiscal years, fiscal 24 and fiscal 25. It shows estimated revenues and expenditures deposited into the general fund only. And on that note, I just wanted to speak on the general fund. The general fund is the state's largest single non-dedicated fund. State collections of income tax, corporate tax, and sales tax are deposited into the general fund. Expenditures from this fund can be made for any authorized state activity, but spending is limited by legislative appropriations. So on the left side of this chart, I apologize, it is fairly small. It shows the estimated state general fund revenue. And for the fiscal 24 and 25 biennium, the estimated biennial total is $57.8 billion. And you can see again, the top three tax types are income tax, sales tax, and corporate taxes. The committee's work in this area affects the amount of revenue on the bottom line. Sorry about that. And then on the right side of the slide, you can see the total estimated general fund expenditures, or that total is $53.9 billion for the fiscal 24 and 25 biennium. The finance committees with the largest total expenditures, general fund expenditures, are E12, Health and Human Services, and Property Tax Aids and Credits. The Property Tax Aids and Credits is a division within the House Tax Committee. So the House Tax Committee is unique, and some would say the best committee, because it makes both policy on the revenue side and on the spending side, or as Representative Olson said, it's kind of the A and B side of the record. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleagues in House Research, and they will be covering the characteristics of an effective tax system. And we'll be discussing in more detail the tax rates, the tax base, and the tax incidence of each major tax type. Thank you.
Before our fiscal staff take off, I think that Representative Pinto had a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I just want to follow up on the comment, the general fund is the largest non-dedicated fund, and I'm guessing it's maybe the largest fund. Can you just give a sense as to kind of order of magnitude, how it compares to the dedicated revenue sources, I guess, often? Well, if you could just briefly expand on that. I'm just curious about how the $57.8 billion compares to other revenue coming in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Ms. Templin.
Madam Chair, Representative Pinto, if I understand the question, yes, the general fund is the largest source of revenue, and that is a non-dedicated fund, but there are dedicated funds also received by the state, and especially in the area of transportation, there's a lot of constitutionally dedicated funds like the Highway User Distribution Fund and other funds in the transportation area that are dedicated. And to a lesser extent, there are dedicated funds in the Health and Human Services area. As you know, the Healthcare Access Fund is also dedicated.
Okay, good, okay.
Representative Pinto?
Thank you, Madam
Good,
Chair.
great.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Thank you so much to our fiscal staff. We'll be seeing a lot more of you. Oh, yeah, please, Ms. Schill.
Representative Pinto and members, also, there is a comprehensive consolidated fund statement that we get regularly that brings all of the funds together into one document. Now, if you have an interest in a particular fund, we can provide that information. But if I understand one portion of your question, the general fund, last time I looked, I haven't looked since COVID, so was about half. Okay, and the rest of the funds about another half.
Really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Schill, if you wouldn't mind, I've never heard of the consolidated fund statement, but that sounds like something I would love to see. I wonder if you could just send it to the committee members if you have a chance?
Madam Chair and members, yes, and
Thank
I
you.
can provide one of those electronic links for you that I mentioned as one of our helpful resources. Yeah, there's a lot of information there you can delve through.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks again to our fiscal staff.
Chair Gomez and members, my name is Sean Williams. I'm from House Research, and I staff individual income taxes and also the property tax refund program. I'm going to start by talking about sort of more terms, concepts, maybe a framework for thinking about taxes. There's a lot of these different frameworks. If you were looking for something exciting to do this weekend, you can dig into different frameworks for evaluating tax policy. In this case, I've selected the framework from the Government Accountability Office, which is a federal government office that's kind of similar to our legislative auditor. It's a nonpartisan office that kind of evaluates federal programs, and they put together this framework for what constitutes a good tax system. I selected this amongst others because it's pretty simple. They just have 3 kind of key values on here, but I'm going to talk about a couple of other ways to think about the tax system as well. As I go through this criteria, I guess I should start by saying these are not sort of absolute values. It's not like you need to pick one of these and maximize for it. In many cases, tax policies will kind of trade off between these values. So you might be picking one of these values over another and selecting different policy choices, and it's sort of your job as policymakers to decide which of these values to sort of place an emphasis on in determining policy and shaping the tax system. In the GAO system, the first criteria is equity, and the GAO breaks that into 2 kind of versions of equity. There's horizontal equity and vertical equity. Horizontal equity is the idea that the same tax should apply to individuals with the same ability to pay. And what that means is, in many cases, sort of the source or kind of income should not affect the amount of taxes paid. So from a horizontal equity perspective, we should pay the same taxes on wages or capital gains, and the source of that income shouldn't affect the rate that's paid. Vertical equity is the concept that taxpayers with a greater ability to pay should pay more tax, and that's, I think, probably what's more commonly meant when discussing equity in the tax system. But I think in tax world, equity might have a more kind of technical meaning than it does maybe in other areas. Another criteria that the GAO mentions is economic efficiency, and the idea of that is that the tax code should reduce economic distortion. So taxes, by sort of intervening in the economy, kind of can reduce well-being. They can direct resources away from sort of the highest value economic uses. So to take an example, maybe, if you imagine a policy to just exempt all taxes paid by restaurateurs, so people running restaurants, that might on the margin push people into the restaurant business that otherwise wouldn't be engaged in it. They might not be engaged in sort of their highest, most productive economic activity, but because of the tax preferences, they might go into owning a restaurant. I should say also that's not necessarily always a bad thing. Maybe you have a policy goal that you want to direct resources towards that system. You know, in the conformity bill, there's the restaurant revitalization and other programs where you as policymakers chose to do that. But sort of one value you might want to keep in mind is to sort of avoid policies that are overly distortionary. The third value that the GAO talks about is simplicity, transparency, and accountability. So the idea is that a simple tax code is more easy to understand for taxpayers. It reduces compliance costs for the private sector for taxpayers that are filing their taxes. And it also reduces administrative costs for the Department of Revenue. And transparent systems that taxpayers can understand, they reduce the uncertainty faced by taxpayers and businesses, allow for better decision making in the long term. And it's also worth mentioning, and the GAO mentioned this in their report, that administrative costs fall both on private and public actors here. So if we have a very complicated system for depreciating property, for example, that's something that makes it hard for the Department of Revenue to administer the tax code, but it also makes it hard for private taxpayers to file their taxes. They might have higher preparer costs. The GAO also emphasizes that to the extent that the tax system causes economic distortion and puts compliance costs on both the public sector and private sector, those are deadweight losses. They're costs that don't sort of produce consumer or producer surplus. There's no economic value to those compliance costs and to those economic distortions. I thought it would be helpful to bring in a couple sort of other values that we end up talking about a lot in tax committee here that weren't necessarily directly mentioned in that GAO framework. So one topic that comes up a lot, and I know members have mentioned this during our sort of introductions today, is competitiveness. So does having a particular tax system disadvantage the state in competing for business with other states, disadvantage the United States internationally as well, competitiveness can mean? Another one is revenue sufficiency. So does the tax system raise enough revenue to fund state government? And it's obviously a question for the tax committee and policymakers at what level they want to fund that, but presumably you want to have enough, sort of contingent on making a decision about how big state government should be, you want to have enough revenue to fund that. Another kind of related concept is that you may want to reduce revenue volatility. So, certain taxes, and we're going to discuss that a little bit during our presentation, certain taxes tend to have a little bit more volatile revenues, and it maybe benefits to having multiple kinds of taxes to reduce volatility. Another value is certainty. So can taxpayers adequately predict the future tax climate. You know, an example of this might be some of these business extender provisions that we talked about during the tax conformity debate. Because they're extended on a year-by-year basis, they're sort of contingent on Congress acts. That may reduce taxpayer certainty. Businesses don't know what their depreciation schedules will be for a certain property. They don't know necessarily what the tax climate will be. And the last thing that's mentioned in some of these sort of frameworks is compliance and tax cap, and that's just reducing the difference between the taxes paid and the taxes owed, and that's just making sure people follow the law, and pay the amount of tax they actually owe. I also wanted to mention that if you look at property tax revenue estimates, which you'll see more in the division than in the broader tax committee, but there's actually on each of those revenue sits, they score each proposal, each bill on 6 benchmarks. I'm not going to read them off, but they're on the slides in front of you. So the Department of Revenue, the Property Tax Research Division will sort of score each of the proposals in the Property Tax Division on these principles. And the idea is that might give you some more information when you're sort of making choices about what bills to put forward. I'm next going to talk about the individual income tax. So, as Templin mentioned, the largest state tax. It is forecast to, we're forecast to collect $15.1 billion in fiscal year 2023. If you look at the graph here, they're actually forecasting a small reduction in income tax revenues next year because they're also baking a predicted recession into the forecast. Along with being the largest tax collected by the state, the income tax is one of the few taxes that is progressive. And so, as Ms. Schell mentioned, a progressive tax is a tax where higher income taxpayers pay a larger portion of their income in taxes than lower income taxpayers. In this case, the income tax is a little bit unique. You'll see that the bottom 20% of taxpayers actually have a negative tax liability. And that's because of our refundable credits like the working family credit, the dependent care credit, and others. You can also see that the rate increases as you go up the income distribution. So the top 20% of taxpayers pay 6% of their income. And then this has additional data from the Department of Revenue's incidence study about the top 5% of taxpayers and the top 1% of taxpayers. One result of that progressivity is that the top 20% of taxpayers sort of pay the overwhelming share of the individual income tax. So you can see here almost 75% of the individual income tax is paid by the top 20% of taxpayers. Again, the first quintile, the bottom 20% pay a negative amount of their income in tax, and that's again due to refundable credits. This slide, I showed it during the conformity bill hearing earlier, and I'm going to show it again. I think it's helpful to sort of visualize how we have a relationship between the federal income tax and the state income tax. So it looks like there's a question.
Excuse me, Representative Swedzinski.
No, thank you, Madam Chair. And just to that point, you talked about the kind of the first quintile and the payments for the income level, and it's 0.09% of which the income tax. Does that take into account so like if you, in the first quintile, you know, a vast majority of those taxpayers are negative taxpayers, so essentially they're receiving more through the tax code than they're paying into. Does that amount count? So like if you took all taxes, let's take, you take sales tax, you take kind of the non-income based related and take an all base tax, where does that, have we analyzed that number as far as, you know, where do they sit?
Mr. Williams.
Chair Gomez and Representative Swedzinski, I think the slide that we showed here is just the income tax in isolation. Yep. The tax incidence study, I think, does show the overall incidence of Minnesota's tax system. So you can compare sort of how this negative income tax might offset taxes paid in other areas by that bottom quintile, or, and they have it by decile in the tax incidence study. So the negative income tax would partially offset taxes paid in other areas. And we can share with you some of those charts from the tax incidence study showing the sort of overall tax system. But I think that the income tax is the only one where there's sort of this negative liability issues, and that's because of these refundable credits. So Chair Gomez and members, the state tax system is based upon the federal tax system. We talked about that a bit last week during the conformity conversation. I'm going to spend a little bit more time with this than I did yesterday. So at the top, sort of the first calculation that you'll do on your federal tax form is your calculation of gross income. That's really just all of your income, gross income from your source derived. And so that includes wages, capital gains, business incomes and losses, interest, things like that. Something I'd note is that in the individual income tax is the tax that's paid by pass-through entities, so partnerships, LLCs, S corporations. And so while it's the individual income tax and we have a corporate franchise tax that Mr. Klama will talk about, businesses end up paying the individual income tax as well. From there, you would take your gross income. On your federal form, you'll calculate adjustments, which are sometimes called above-the-line deductions. In this case, the line is the line for adjusted gross income. So these are deductions that reduce your adjusted gross income. So they're things like student loan interest, IRA contributions, tuition, and those all reduce your AGI. And so any changes to federal law that affects those above-the-line deductions would flow through to Minnesota if we chose to conform to them. So the next calculation is, you can see on the chart here that Minnesota's tax system sort of breaks away from the federal tax system at this point. And Minnesota adds additions, so there's certain things that are not taxable in Minnesota or that are taxable federally, or excuse me, that are not taxable federally that you add back on your Minnesota form. We have Minnesota subtractions. There's things that Minnesota allows basically as deductions that are not allowed federally. We have a state dependent exemption, which is $4,800 in tax year 23. I'll talk about that in a moment. And then we have state standard or itemized deductions. Our state standard deduction is basically is similar to the federal amount, but we've actually kind of decoupled from that. So the federal standard deduction is going to be changing in tax year 2025 when the TCJA expires, but Minnesota will keep our current law standard deduction amount. And then Minnesota also has its own system of itemized deductions for things like mortgage interest, property taxes paid, casualty losses, and those sorts of things.
Mr. Williams? So just on the, sorry, just sort of out of curiosity, I guess. So in 2025, when those provisions of the TCJA expire, does that mean that the standard deduction is going back down to the pre-TCJA levels federally?
Chair Gomez and members, federally, yes. So the TCJA framework was sort of a larger standard deduction, the elimination of personal exemptions, the replacement of the dependent exemption with the child credit. But those policies were temporary federally, and so they expire effective tax year 25. When Minnesota conformed to the TCJA changes, we sort of elected to make those changes in state law permanently, so we're not on sort of an extender cliff for those provisions like we might be with other expiring federal provisions.
And can you just remind me what those numbers are now, like what the standard deduction, maybe that's too much of a quiz to put you on the spot for. That's like 17.
Chair Gomez and members, they're not sort of finalized yet because those parameters are indexed for inflation federally, so we don't know what the inflation reads will be that far out. Our state dependent exemption is indexed to the old law federal amount, so the federal amount should be pretty similar to what we have in state law now. And the standard deduction federally prior to the TCJA was around $13,000, so that gives you a ballpark of where it is. So it'll be greater than that because we've had inflation since 2017 when that was enacted.
Thank you. And I think Representative Joachim, did you have a question?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Williams, remind me, the SALT cap, that $10,000, will that expire in 26, or did we didn't put that in statute, did we?
Mr. Williams?
Chair Joachim and members, so that the federal SALT cap is set to expire. It's either 25 or 26 that that's expired. I think that may have been extended, but I'm not certain on that. So, but the SALT cap will expire federally. We sort of imposed in state law in our itemized deduction. The SALT cap doesn't apply for state taxes in exactly the same way because you're talking about deducting your state taxes on your state taxes in that instance. We do have a state deduction for taxes paid. It's mostly for property taxes, although there are some other taxes that are covered. And we have in state law a $10,000 property tax deduction cap. That is permanent in state law and not subject to expiration.
Representative Joachim, you good? Great, thank you.
So Chair Gomez and members, after sort of you calculate Minnesota taxable income, so that's adjusted gross income plus our state additions, minus the dependent exemption, minus standard or itemized deductions, and minus Minnesota subtractions, you get our taxable income. That's our tax base. We have our own rates and brackets that will apply to that tax base. I'll talk about those next. And that would get you your tax before credits. And then Minnesota has a number of non-refundable and refundable credits that would be applied to your tax to reduce your tax liability, for example, the working family credit, the marriage credit, the student loan credit. And that's how you get your Minnesota tax after credits. So again, this is the calculation. I just went through it. This is just sort of another way of visualizing that. But this is how we calculate our tax base. So it's adjusted gross income plus additions minus dependent exemption, standard or itemized deductions, or other Minnesota subtractions. And that's Minnesota taxable income. I'm not going to read these out loud individually, but you can see here we have four tax rates in our tax code that Minnesota taxable income is subject to. They range from 5.35% to 9.85%. You can see where the brackets start for married, joint, single, and head of household filers in tax year 2023. You can see the standard deduction numbers here also. One way to think of those standard deduction numbers is they're effectively a zero bracket. And so every taxpayer will at least be allowed the standard deduction, regardless of whether they have dependents and regardless of what their itemized deductions are. So the first $27,650 of income is not subject to taxation in Minnesota. So those brackets, that $0 in the married joint bracket is really starting at about $27,650 when you take into account the standard deduction. The dependent exemption in Minnesota is $4,800 per dependent. That's in tax year 23. So for each dependent the taxpayer has, they would also be allowed to subtract $4,800 from their income. And to really belabor this point, I guess I'm going to walk through sort of an example calculation here. So this is sort of a hypothetical family of three with $75,000 of wage income. They have student loans and childcare expenses. And the reason I picked this example is it sort of gives you things to put on each line of this calculation so you can sort of walk through how it works. So this family has $75,000 of gross income and wages. They'd subtract their student loan interest, that's $2,500, that's the cap federally. That would get them their adjusted gross income on their federal return, which is $72,500. They would take K-12 expense subtraction in this case of $1,625. They'd take the Minnesota standard deduction that I just described, the dependent exemption for one child of $4,800, and that would get a Minnesota taxable income amount of $38,425. All of that income would fall in the 5.35% bottom bracket, which would give them a tax liability of $2,056. In this case, this taxpayer has taken a $500 non-refundable student loan credit, which brings their liability down to $1,500. And then they also take a $600 refundable dependent care credit, which brings their liability down to $956. In this case, if this taxpayer had a lower income amount and their tax liability before refundable credits was less than $600, then potentially that dependent care credit could reduce their tax liability to the state to a negative number. And so that's when we were talking about the income distribution, that's how you get people with a negative liability. And it's a topic that comes up in conversation, and Michelle mentioned this briefly, but it's a refundable credit is one that can reduce your tax liability to negative and exceed what your liability is. I'm going to briefly talk about tax expenditures. This is sort of another topic that comes up on occasion in committee. An imprecise way of describing a tax expenditure is just spending through the tax code. We have in state law a definition of tax expenditures, which is the tax provision that provides a gross income definition, a deduction, exemption, credit, or rate for certain persons, types of incomes, transactions, or property that results in reduced tax revenue. It also excludes provisions used to mitigate tax pyramiding, which is more of a sales tax issue. We established in the 2021 tax bill a tax expenditure review commission that regularly sort of goes through these expenditures, reviews them. They produced a report in December 2022, the sort of first report of that commission, and the tax committee is required in law to hold a public hearing on that report. Tax expenditures are not necessarily good or bad. There are kinds of things that you would evaluate in the context of some of those tax policy values that were discussed earlier in the presentation. But in this case, in the income tax, at least, there's quite a few of them, and I thought it'd be worth highlighting. So there are actually 40 federal exclusions that are adopted for state purposes. You can read through these in the Department of Revenue's tax expenditure report. So examples of these would be the non-taxability of employer health insurance contributions. Some of your Social Security is non-taxable federally, and we adopt that for state purposes. Dependent care assistance, so dependent flex spending accounts, those are all excluded from income federally, and we conform to those exclusions. Minnesota, as I mentioned, has 7 tax expenditures related to itemized or standard deductions. We provide an additional standard deduction for elderly taxpayers, and so that's the one that is the addition to the standard deduction piece. We also have itemized deductions for property taxes and other taxes paid, charitable contributions, interest, primarily mortgage interest, medical expenses, and casualty and theft losses. We have 14 subtractions covering a variety of sort of different areas. So we have an additional subtraction for Social Security income, for some K-12 education expenses, for contributions to 529 accounts, to National Guard or National Guard or military income, some cannabis business expenses, volunteer driver reimbursement, so people who volunteer and get reimbursed by a nonprofit for driving, and so on. We also have 14 credits. The working family credit is one of the largest, the care credit, the small business or angel investment credit, credit for student loans, the credit for 529 contributions, beginning farmer credits, and credit for parents of stillborn children. So that covers the income tax, and unless there's more questions, my colleague, Mr. Clayman, will cover the corporate franchise tax.
Representative Robbins.
Thank you, Chair Gomez. Thank you, Mr. Williams. Going way back, when you talked about the forecast of recession, what is the forecast predicting in terms of economic growth for the state?
Mr. Williams.
Chair Gomez and Representative Robbins, I don't have that immediately available. Maybe our fiscal staff do, or maybe our fiscal staff would, prefer to follow up with you after committee with that detail.
Yeah, Ms. Templin, do you want to come up, or do you want to just, should we follow up afterwards? It might be a little bit, yeah.
Chair Gomez and Representative Robbins, it looks like Ms. Templin's pulling out the forecast reports.
All right.
If we can wait a minute or so, we'll be in good shape.
Representative Robbins.
Thank you, Chair. I'm happy to have her just send me a note. Thank you.
Well, our trusty fiscal staff happens to have that in her binder, so thank you, Ms.
Madam
Templin.
Chair, Representative Robbins, Cynthia Templin, House Fiscal Staff. I do have the forecast in front of me, the document in front of me, and just very generally, without going into much detail, I do remember the economists stating that they predict a mild recession in fiscal 24 and 25. And beyond that, I would have to refer to the exact numbers on GDP and other details, and I can provide that to you after the hearing.
Great, thank you, Ms. Templin.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Mr. Clayman.
Madam Chair and members, my name is Chris Clayman, also with the House Research Department. My colleague Sean Williams, who just presented, he handles the individual income tax. I handle the corporate franchise tax. It's a separate tax. We'll get into that here in a little bit. And so in general, how we divide up the income tax work in House Research is, again, Mr. Williams does individual. I do the business side, the corporate franchise tax side. Sometimes there's overlap, but that's generally how it breaks down. The first couple slides are just going to be the numbers here. This is corporate franchise tax collection. So this is the revenue that the corporate franchise tax generates for the state. And you can see the 23 forecast is $2.4 billion. So that's quite a bit lower than what you saw under the individual income tax. I think the individual income tax was like 14, 15 billion, somewhere around there. I'm somewhat more imprecise with numbers here than Ms. Templin is. She can obviously give you the precise number, but the point here is that it's on relative terms, it's quite a bit smaller than what the individual income tax raises.
Sorry, Mr. Clayman, before we go on, I think like sort of conceptually I knew this was the case, but I'm really surprised by how much money we collected in this in the last couple years. And I wonder, maybe this is a little bit like outside of your purview, but I'm just trying to think through like, what was it about the economic conditions, especially during, the public health emergency, where, I think so many people in our community were experiencing work loss, income loss, economic stressors. A lot, we heard from a lot of lot of small businesses, certainly in our communities, about how kind of hard it was. I'm just really surprised that we collected so much corporate tax revenue during that time, and I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about the economic conditions that created that spike that we see on this slide. Or maybe we want to, tell me what you think, and if we need to go to somebody else or put that conversation off, we can do that, but.
Sure, Madam Chair. I think I just make a very general comment, or a couple general comments on this. One would be, I think part of what you're seeing here is just inflation, right? So you had high inflation, and there's a lot of question about where that came from, a lot of discussion about where that came from, and so I think you see that showing up in the corporate franchise tax receipts here. I think the same is true for instance, under the individual income tax as well. If you go back, you can see on that other slide, you also saw kind of a similar effect there as well. And I think, one other comment to make on that would be, who are the taxpayers here that are actually paying the corporate franchise tax? Also, who are the taxpayers who are paying the bulk of that individual income tax? And going back to Mr. Williams' comments about, the negative effective rate and refundable tax credits, I think that sort of points out that there is some sort of some polarization in terms of, who's actually paying that tax. So you can have a large number of people who maybe aren't paying a lot of income tax because there's a recession and they're not, like the pandemic, for instance. And so they're not paying a lot of tax. On the other hand, I think there's probably a case to be made there was some polarization there. So there's maybe a bifurcation. So there were a lot of other taxpayers who actually were paying potentially more tax, not in terms of percentage, but just in terms of, the total volume. So I guess I'd leave it there, and we could, provide you with some further information on that. Later, I have another discussion about it, but.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I guess I'm struck by, because, if you are talking about there's inflation, that price of goods has gone up, but this corporate franchise tax is levied after all of that is accounted for, right? And so this is a tax on profits. And then also, you pointed back to the individual income tax and seeing that a really big increase in those collections also in 2020 to 2022, and that's why we have this huge surplus that we're dealing with, right? But I guess I just want us to note that this there are certain people and there are certain entities in our economy who benefited greatly during this time that was really economically difficult for a lot of working people, for a lot of small business owners. And so I guess I'm just struck by that, by kind of just, we need to keep that in mind, that this sort of increase in tax collections reflects the fact that a lot of people who were invested in the stock market made a lot of money. A lot of giant corporations made a lot of money during that time when a lot of people in our communities were really suffering a lot. And so I guess I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Yep, and Madam Chair, I think that's true. I think that's true to say that, the net income increased, so that amount that's actually taxed under the corporate franchise tax increased during those periods, as you can see from the graph. One other comment to make on the corporate franchise tax relative to the individual income tax is that a lot of the pass-through businesses, this sort of relates to, why the corporate franchise tax doesn't bring in as much revenue as the individual income tax. Of course, there's not wage income that's being taxed there. That's because most of the businesses in the state, just numerically, are going to be pass-through businesses. And the corporate franchise tax just applies to the C corporations. So the big publicly traded C corporations. So there's fewer of them in the state just numerically, and then you can see just as a percentage of revenue too. Probably also the case, I think you could make that assumption.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. And I don't know if is there a slide in here that's about kind of that you know, sort of the number of firms and the amount of I don't know how to talk about it exactly, but just sort of that split between pass-through entities and corporations. I'm not sure if it's here or if maybe we should have that conversation at a future time, but I think that's something that's important for us all to understand in terms of like the ways that business kind of profits get accounted for in individual income taxes. Like, so just kind of a comment and maybe future thing for us to discuss. Thank you.
And Madam Chair, so we don't have a slide in there, and I think the slide you're looking for would be a slide that looks at trade or business income and how much trade or business income that's taxable in the state is from a pass-through business versus how much is from a C corporation. As I was making my prior comment, I realized, oh yeah, you really can't tell that just by looking at the individual income tax collections, because a lot of that's going to be wage income, dividend income, and so forth. But yeah, I think, you know, there may be a way for us to kind of back into that number. So I'll reconnoiter with my colleague, Mr. Williams, and we'll see about coming up with some information on that. But that's not a slide that we have here. Okay, so moving on. The corporate franchise tax, this is contrary to the individual income tax. If you remember that slide that Mr. Williams showed under the individual income tax, you have that negative effective tax rate for the first quintile. Here for the corporate franchise tax, you almost see the opposite distribution. This looks much more like almost like a tax on consumption, like a sales tax, and Ms. Hagler is going to go through the sales tax portion of the presentation. This kind of looks more like the instance you'd see with a sales tax. So the corporate franchise tax is regressive. That tax is generally assumed to, most of it, to be passed through to consumers. Some of that is, actually a lot of that is exported to non-resident consumers, but most of it passes through to consumers in the state. It gets priced through the increase in pricing of goods and services by corporations subject to the tax. Some of that's passed on to labor and some to capital as well.
Representative Elkins.
Real quick, so do we have an estimate about how much of it is exported?
Madam Chair and Representative Elkins, that's in the Department of Revenue's tax incidence study. And I'm going to, by memory, I don't know if I can tell you the exact percentage, but it's in the 40% range that's exported to non-resident consumers. So, and we can get that exact number and or show you where to see that in the tax incidence report.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Klayman. Representative Elkins.
Almost all states have taxes like this, even though we all know that they're regressive. And I think that the reason all states have this is that they know a big share of the taxes exported to the residents of other states.
Thank you, Representative Elkins. Mr. Klayman?
Yep, thank you, Madam Chair. Here's another slide. This shows the, instead of the effective tax rates, that's the other slide on incidence. This is a slide that shows the percentage of the corporate franchise tax paid by population quintile. Again, that's for that fifth quintile, they're still paying a plurality of the tax. But the individual income tax number for individuals was in the 70% range, and this is in the 40% range. So that's another difference. And that, I think, just reflects more consumption of goods and services by individuals or in the fifth quintile.
Mm-hmm.
Next slide. One other comment to make about the corporate franchise tax. This is a separate tax than the individual income tax. It's also imposed on a measure of net income, but the starting point for the tax is different than federal adjusted gross income. Mm-hmm. And you know, another huge difference with this tax is it's a tax that's imposed at the entity level. So the corporation as an entity is subject to this tax and they pay it. And so there's some differences between how a business is taxed under the corporate franchise tax and how a pass-through business is taxed. For a pass-through business, they pay essentially their tax on their trade or business income through the individual income tax code. And so that trade or business income is going to be subject to a different rate structure than the corporate franchise tax, for instance. And it's going to get lumped in with all their other income potentially, and of course they can take the individual personal deductions against that, subtractions here in the state, like itemized deductions and so forth. Not so much the case with the corporate franchise tax. But because the corporate franchise tax is a tax at the entity level, there is, because of the SALT deduction that was referenced earlier, there's a limit federally on the SALT deduction. That limit doesn't apply to state and local taxes federally under the corporate franchise tax. Because those taxes are paid at the entity level, the federal government deems them to be business expenses, so they're fully deductible. For a pass-through business that's paying those through the individual income tax, they're limited to that $10,000 SALT cap. So we actually have there's actually a tax that was enacted in the state of Minnesota a couple of years ago called the pass-through entity tax, which allows individual pass-through businesses to make their state tax that they pay on their pass-through income deductible federally by electing to pay this state PTE tax. There's not a slide on that, but that's kind of one application of this concept. The other one too is, of course, the double taxation issue. Under the corporate franchise tax, because they're taxed at the entity level, then if that corporation, say, returns a dividend to an individual, that dividend is going to be taxed again as income to the owner. Although there are certainly a lot of nonprofits and so forth that are exempt from taxation, pension funds and so forth. So it's not the case that every single dividend or every single piece of corporate income is going to be subject to double taxation. But that's sort of the trade-off, one of the tax trade-offs between organizing as a corporation versus a pass-through entity. Just some different tax planning considerations there. So the corporate franchise tax, it starts with federal taxable income, not federal adjusted gross income. That's because those things like the dependent exemption that Mr. Williams talked about, not really an issue for the corporate franchise tax. Corporate entities aren't natural born persons, so they don't have children. They can't take a dependent exemption. So it's efficient to stay on the federal taxable income. And so the decision back in 2019 was to stay on FTI, as we call it, for corporations. The rate is 9.8%. Again, just the income of C corporations here that's taxed, not S corporations. Usually not limited liability corporations. They could elect to be taxed that way if they wanted, but doesn't include that. Again, tax incidence, it's a regressive tax, as noted earlier. This is a slide just to show in general how this corporate franchise tax is calculated. Similar to the individual income tax, but there's some notable differences here. One is, of course, the starting point, federal taxable income. The other one is the second to last box here. That's for Minnesota apportionment factor. Corporate income is apportioned to the state. So that's not something that necessarily happens with the individual income tax. So there's a separate step that has to be done to apportion that income to the state of Minnesota. That's because corporations, a lot of them, typically, they're going to have income from a variety of states. And so the question is, there's a constitutional requirement. So the state can only tax basically its fair share of corporate income. So that has to be apportioned. In Minnesota, that's apportioned based on sales. So it's percentage of Minnesota sales that the corporation has. Becomes your Minnesota apportionment factor. And that's how that income's apportioned to the state. Then there are a couple deductions.
Oh, just a quick question on the apportionment piece. So it's only about the apportionment factor is only based on sales, not any other factors. I'm just wondering if that's always been the case, and if there are sort of other ways to approach the question of apportionment between the states.
Madam Chair, that has not always been the case. Minnesota, until I think roughly 15 years ago, had an apportionment formula that included some measure of property and payroll. So how much property you have in the state, how much percentage of your payroll is in the state. Minnesota always overweighted sales, even when there was a three-factor apportionment formula. But yeah, there are alternate ways to apportion corporate income to the state. And so, I mean, I can get into detail on that a little bit more, Madam Chair, if you'd like, but yes, there's.
Yeah, I'm trying to think through the sort of, there might be different kinds of businesses that either doing a single or three-factor apportionment, that it gives sort of certain kinds of businesses benefits. And so I'm trying to think that through. Maybe you and I can have a conversation about that in the future, but it was just appreciate the background on that.
Sure, and Madam Chair, more states have moved to single sales factor apportionment like Minnesota has, or they overweight sales now. It's seen as a way to make businesses that are headquartered in a state more competitive with out-of-state businesses that don't have property or payroll. Because in some ways you could see those payroll and property factors as imposing quote unquote a penalty on an in-state business. And so you could have the same number of sales in the state between the two businesses, and yet one would have a higher apportionment percentage because they had more property and payroll in the state. Of course, then the other question is, well, what's the overarching, reason for the apportionment system for the tax code in general, who's using resources and so forth. So there's, I think, a couple of different perspectives to bring to that, that tax idea.
Right, because, if you have employees and property in a state, then you're using the public services more, I would assume. You're sort of relying on those public investments. So I just wanted to make that as a final point.
Madam Chair?
Representative Olson.
Yeah, I'd also like to point out that when we're looking at that, every one of the individuals working in the state of Minnesota is paying income tax. Every one of the property is being paid for with property tax as well. So it probably is pretty decent the way it is, if not more so.
Yeah.
And Representative Anderson.
Madam Chair, I would be interested in getting a presentation on this, including the case law, because obviously other states, there's only 100 slices in a company, and both states can't claim 75 of them. So in the end, how is that determined for, companies, C Corps we're talking about? Because that's what this,
Great.
I'd be very interested in spending an hour, Madam Chair.
Excellent. Sounds like a future learning we can do together.
Yeah.
Great. Representative Anderson. Was there somebody else down there with their hand up? No. Oh, sorry. Okay. Back to you, Mr. Clayman.
Sure, and Madam Chair and Representative Anderson, yeah, I'd be happy to put together some sort of presentation or handout on some of the constitutional issues in taxation regarding how to fairly apportion, corporate income among the states. One other comment to note, on the corporate franchise tax, the state of Minnesota also has what's called unitary taxation. So if you've got companies under common ownership, there's a flow of value between them. They're treated as a single entity, sort of, for purposes of determining what the determining what their tax is. And what happens in unitary taxation is a lot of intercompany transactions, they cancel out, they're eliminated, and then all the income is then apportioned to each one of those unitary corporations. And then based on, this is getting a little technical, based on the total number of sales of every company included in the unitary group, based on their total domestic sales, and then the individual Minnesota sales that each corporation has. So that's unitary taxation. Again, the big thing is eliminating the intercompany transactions that many states, I think the idea is that can distort a true measure of how much income is properly apportionable to a taxing state. Finally, the final way that the corporate franchise tax is computed, after you go through this exercise on the slide before, I forgot to mention some of those deductions, that's okay. But there are some deductions that come at the end calculation. That gives you your final Minnesota taxable income, and then multiplied by the 9.8% rate. And then like the individual income tax, then you have tax credits that are applied to that amount of tax. That gives you your Minnesota tax liability. Madam Chair, that concludes the corporate franchise tax portion of the presentation.
Excellent. And even though we have Ms. Hagler up at the table, we're going to have to wait till tomorrow to get into sales taxes, it looks like. Sorry. But we did a good job, I think, ending on time, and we just really appreciate all this information and look forward to continuing in our next at least one meeting this week. So with that, we are adjourned.